Keeper's Journal, October 31st, 1836. The sea does not rest. Each night the wind claws at the glass and the waves rise like something alive, seeking what was lost. I have kept the light for 3 months now, and though my charge is to guard men from death, I feel death's breath upon me. The other keepers do not hear it, but I do. The whispers in the fog. They sound like drowned sailors reciting prayers through waterlogged tongues. Last night, the fog bell tolled on its own. No wind stirred it. No hand touched it. And when I looked down from the lantern room, I saw them. Figures standing on the rocks below. Pale, gleaming, wet as if the sea had spat them out. They watched the light burn. I told the others, but they only laughed and said I'd been too long without sleep. Still, the sea calls. If I do not answer, I fear it will come for me. The journal ends abruptly. The ink dragged across the page as though the pen were snatched from the writer's hand. It would be more than a century before anyone opened it again. Thomas Greaves had driven from London that morning, through miles of twisting country roads, each narrower than the last. Autumn had set the hedgerows aflame with red and gold, but as he neared the coast, the colour bled away. The sky darkened, and the wind carried the salt of the channel. He parked near the cliffs and stepped out into the chill. Crooked Rock Lighthouse stood ahead, tall, white, lonely, its glass crown gleaming dimly in the grey. It was beautiful, in the way old and forgotten places are beautiful. A monument to duty, decay, and the sea. Thomas was not a lighthouse keeper. He was a historian, a lecturer on maritime folklore. His publisher had offered him a modest advance for a Halloween feature on the haunted lighthouses of Britain. Crooked Rock, with its reputation for ghostly lights and spectral shipwrecks, had seemed the perfect subject. He trudged down the winding path toward the keepers' cottages, now abandoned, the windows boarded and roofs streaked with moss. The tower itself had been automated decades ago, its lamp now cold. He had arranged his visit through the Trinity House archives, promising to stay only one night and leave everything as he found it. He carried his satchel of notes, a camera, and a single overnight bag. Inside, the air smelled of dust and salt. The entryway was small, with worn stone steps spiraling upward into darkness. He flicked on his flashlight, the beam catching the faint gleam of brass fittings and the ghost of old polish. At the base of the stairwell, a wooden table stood under a broken lantern. On it lay an old logbook, its pages swollen with moisture. The first entry read, E. Ward, Headkeeper, 1836. Thomas smiled faintly. Elias Ward, the man whose name appeared in every legend tied to this place. Some said he'd gone mad, others that he'd drowned himself during a storm. None of the records agreed on how he died. He unpacked his laptop and voice recorder, setting them on the table. The wind moaned outside like something in mourning. He began recording. October 31st, 2025. Location, Crooked Rock Lighthouse, Devon. This is Thomas Greaves, documenting first impressions. His voice echoed faintly in the stairwell. The building remains structurally sound. The original keeper's quarters are derelict, though the main tower still stands intact. According to local accounts, the last known haunting occurred in 1954. Reports of lights seen from the cliffs and the sound of the fog bell ringing without wind. He paused. Tonight, I intend to test the legend. He laughed quietly at his own theatricality. It felt right for Halloween. By sunset, the horizon had turned copper. The sea below was restless, crashing hard against the jagged rocks. Thomas climbed the narrow stairs to the lantern room. The glass panes were salt-stained, and the great Fresnel lens sat like a crystal heart that had long stopped beating. He took photographs, The lens, the sea, the long sweep of coast that curved away into darkness. Far below, gulls wheeled and cried like lost souls. When the last light faded, he descended to the keeper's quarters to prepare for the night. He had brought tea, a small lantern, and a bottle of whiskey for company. The place was eerily still. Each creak of the floorboards echoed like a footstep behind him. At one point, he thought he heard water dripping, though there was no leak. When he followed the sound, it led him to a locked trapdoor near the base of the tower. He knelt beside it. The lock was rusted solid. Something about it unsettled him. The air there felt colder, heavier, as though it were being drawn downward. He returned to his makeshift desk, determined to record his impressions before imagination got the better of him. He wrote, "The isolation is palpable. Even without the light burning, the tower hums, as though remembering its duty. I keep thinking, I hear the bell, faintly, from somewhere offshore. Impossible, of course." He looked up from his notes. The wind was rising. A fog had rolled in fast, thick, white, swallowing the cliffs. The beam of his lantern illuminated only swirling grey. Somewhere beyond that veil, a faint glow pulsed. Not the light of his lantern, nor the moon. A distant shimmer hovering over the sea. He stood at the window, watching. The light flickered once, twice, and vanished. Then the fog bell tolled. Once, twice, then silence. Thomas's heart quickened. He checked his watch. Midnight. He tried to reason with himself. Perhaps the sound was the buoy, or wind through the cliffs. Yet the air outside was still as stone. He switched on his recorder again. It's midnight. The fog is thick. I've just heard the bell. Possibly atmospheric echo. But when he played it back, the bell didn't sound like an echo. It sounded close, deep, metallic, and followed by something else. A whisper, faint but clear. Light the way. He stopped the recording. His pulse hammered. Outside, through the window, the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. He thought again of Elias Ward, the first keeper, who had written of whispers in the mist. The journal had been dismissed as superstition, a product of madness. Yet now, Thomas felt a creeping certainty. The same voice had spoken to him. He reached for his satchel and withdrew a photocopy of the original Ward journal from the archives. The final entry, dated October 31st, was smudged and nearly unreadable. He traced the ink with his finger. The words seemed almost to move under his touch. The sea calls. The light must burn. He set the journal down and looked up, just in time to see movement at the top of the stairs. A figure. For an instant, it stood there, shadowed, tall, its face hidden by fog seeping in through the cracks. Then it was gone. Thomas leapt to his feet, lantern in hand, and raced up the stairs. The light bobbed wildly, throwing long, lunging shadows across the walls. When he reached the lantern room, it was empty. Only the sea beyond, invisible in the fog. He tried the door, locked from the inside. No one else could have entered. Then he saw it, on the glass of the lens. A handprint, smeared and wet, as though someone had touched it from the outside. The glass was 70 feet above the ground. He backed away, breathing hard. "It's nothing," he whispered to himself. Condensation, just condensation. But he knew better. The air smelled wrong, saltier, heavier, like brine and rot. Down below, the fog bell tolled again. He looked through the glass and saw the faint light return, far out at sea, moving toward the shore. A ship's lantern. Impossible. There were no vessels in these waters tonight. Still, it came closer. And as it did, another light flickered beside it. Then another and another. Dozens now. Glowing shapes, like lanterns carried by invisible hands, moving slowly towards the cliffs. Thomas's breath caught. The lights were beneath the water, and they were rising. He stumbled back down the stairwell, nearly tripping over his bag. The whispers grew louder now, hissing through the cracks of the walls. He could make out words, half-formed, watery. Light. The way. He waits. Below. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the voices seeped through skin and bone. He turned toward the trapdoor. The sound was loudest there. The metal lock trembled, as if struck from beneath. Impossible, he breathed. Then came a knock. Once, twice, 3 times. He stumbled back, heart pounding. The knock stopped. And then the voice came again. This time not a whisper, but a command. Light it. Thomas stood frozen. Outside, the wind screamed. The bell tolled a 3rd time. He ran for the stairs, up toward the lantern room. His every rational thought told him to leave, to drive back to civilization. But another impulse, some ancient, primal duty, pulled him upward. When he reached the top, he saw that the lens had begun to spin, slowly, creaking, though the mechanism was long dead. The light, dark for decades, flared once, then again, as though struggling to breathe. And then, with a blinding flash, it burned to life. The sea below was bathed in pale, unnatural light. Thomas stared, trembling. The light shouldn't work. There was no power, no generator. Yet it turned, sweeping across the fog like an eye. And for a heartbeat, he thought he saw them. Faces in the mist, pale and dripping, looking up at him. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, watching. He stumbled backward, shouting, "Who's there?" The only answer was the crash of waves far below, and the faint scrape of footsteps on the stairwell behind him. The beam turned in slow spectral arcs, sweeping through the fog like a ghostly searchlight. Thomas shielded his eyes. Though the glow had softened, no longer blinding, it pulsed, dimmed, flared again, almost as if breathing. He reached for his recorder with trembling hands. October 31st, 1:23 a.m. The light is on. It's functioning without power. The tape hissed faintly. No response but the wind. He stared at the machinery. The lens revolved on its bearings with a low groan. The sound of metal half asleep for decades. He touched the edge of the apparatus. Cold. It shouldn't be possible. The wiring had been stripped years ago. He crouched and examined the base. Dust thick as grave soil. No hum of electricity. Yet the light burned, brilliant and steady, as though fed by some unseen current. He swallowed hard. "Ward," he whispered. "What did you do?" The name came to him instinctively, unbidden. Elias Ward, the first keeper, the one whose words had warned of the sea's call. Thomas turned away from the light and peered through the window. The fog was still there, dense and unbroken, swallowing even the sound of the surf. But in its depths, something moved, slow, wavering shapes, gliding just below the surface of the mist. At first, he thought they were tricks of reflection, echoes of the revolving beam. But they lingered when the light passed, hovering like lanterns floating on water. One drifted closer, and his breath caught. It wasn't a light. It was a face pale as bone, eyes hollow, hair streaming upward as though underwater. It stared at him, its mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He stumbled back, knocking his shoulder against the lens housing. The image vanished, swallowed again by fog. For a long moment he simply stood there, panting, trying to steady himself. "You're overtired," he whispered. "You've been reading ghost stories and legends all week. That's all this is." But the whisper in the back of his skull disagreed. It didn't sound like his own voice anymore. He descended the spiral staircase, each footstep echoing like a heartbeat in stone. The air grew damp and cold the lower he went, heavy with the smell of brine. His lantern flickered. Halfway down, he paused. Someone was humming, a low, tuneless sound, rising and falling with the wind. It came from below, from the trapdoor at the base of the tower. He gripped the railing tighter. "Hello?" The humming stopped. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. He froze. The light of his lantern wavered as the footsteps drew nearer, echoing closer with every heartbeat. "Who's there?" His voice cracked. The sound stopped, just one flight below him. He took a hesitant step down, shining his lantern over the railing. The beam caught only swirling dust. Nothing moved. He waited. The silence pressed against him like water. Then something whispered directly into his ear. "Light the way." He flinched and nearly dropped the lantern. It swung wildly, throwing grotesque shadows across the walls. No one stood behind him. Only the cold stone and the echo of his own ragged breathing. Thomas stumbled the rest of the way down the stairs and out onto the small gallery that circled the tower. The fog clung to him like wet cloth. He could hear the sea now, restless, beating against the cliffs. He leaned against the railing, trying to catch his breath. His hands trembled. "Get hold of yourself," he muttered. "It's only wind and nerves." But as he stared into the fog, he saw movement again. Closer this time. Dozens of shapes emerging from the grey, drifting across the surface of the sea like survivors of a wreck. He strained to see them clearly. The light from the tower swept over them, illuminating bodies that glistened with seawater. Their faces were pale, eyes black as the depths, and every one of them was staring up at him. He stumbled back from the railing, his heel caught on a loose stone, and he nearly fell. When he looked again, the figures were gone. Only waves remained, crashing against the rocks below. He fled inside and slammed the iron door shut. The echo rang up the stairwell. He sank to the floor, breathing hard. For a moment, there was only silence, until a faint dripping sound returned. He turned toward the trapdoor. The air above it shimmered slightly, like heat on stone. Drops of water seeped through the edges and pooled on the floorboards. "Rain," he told himself, though he knew it wasn't raining. The droplets were dark, almost black, and smelled faintly of salt and rot. He approached slowly. The rusted padlock glistened, wet as though freshly soaked. He could hear something beneath the trapdoor, a hollow, rhythmic thudding, like waves striking a wall. Then, unmistakably, a voice, low, guttural. "Ward, light the way!" Thomas staggered back. "No," he whispered. "You're gone. You've been gone for 200 years. The voice rose in pitch, becoming a chorus. "We are not gone. We are beneath." He covered his ears, but the sound filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards, through his bones. The lantern on the wall flickered violently, then went out, plunging him into darkness. He fumbled for his flashlight and shone it on the trapdoor. The lock had snapped. The metal hung twisted, as though melted from within. "God," he breathed. The thudding stopped. Silence. He waited, the beam trembling in his hand. Then, slowly, the trapdoor creaked open, just an inch. A smell rose from the gap. Wet wood, seaweed, decay. Thomas backed away, but he couldn't look away. Something glistened in the darkness below, catching the edge of his light. A hand. Grey, swollen. Fingers webbed with strands of kelp. It gripped the edge of the hatch and pulled. Thomas turned and bolted up the stairs, 2 steps at a time. The voice followed him, echoing through the tower. "Light the way!" The words crashed like waves, shaking the walls. The tower itself seemed to groan in protest. When he reached the lantern room, the beam had stopped turning. It hung still, its heart of light pulsing slowly. Thomas pressed his back against the wall, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. His breath came in shallow gasps. Then, faintly, he heard the voice again, different now, calm, almost pleading. "You must keep the light. The sea must see." He swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The air thickened, humming with energy. The lens flickered, and within its glass he saw a shape begin to form. A man's outline, translucent and shimmering like light through water. The figure wore a long coat, buttons tarnished, eyes black and hollow. Its face was Thomas's, and not his. "Ward," Thomas whispered. The ghost inclined its head. "The light keeps them at bay," it said, its voice echoing like distant thunder. "If the flame dies, they will rise. They will claim the keeper. Always." Claim? One must stay. One must burn. The figure raised a hand and pointed toward Thomas. "The light must have a keeper." Thomas shook his head. "No, I'm not. This isn't my duty. I'm just here to document." But the spirit's expression twisted. "The sea remembers. The sea replaces." It stepped forward, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Frost formed along the metal rails. Thomas stumbled backward toward the door. "Stay away from me." But the ghost moved closer, its voice deepening to a roar. "Light it!" The entire tower shuddered. The beam flared so bright it burned through his eyelids. And then, abruptly, the light went out. Darkness. Total, suffocating darkness. Thomas's flashlight flickered, then died. The silence that followed was unbearable, until he realized it wasn't silence at all. The tower was breathing. He could hear the groan of metal, the creak of wood, the distant sound of water filling spaces that had long been dry. Somewhere below, the trapdoor slammed open. Footsteps echoed up the stairwell, wet, dragging. Thomas fumbled for his recorder, whispering, "If anyone finds this, don't come here. Don't stay the night. The stories are real." He pocketed it and groped along the wall for the door handle. He found it and wrenched it open, stumbling out onto the balcony once more. The fog had thickened to the point of blindness. He could barely see the railing before him. The sea's roar had vanished. He took a tentative step forward and nearly screamed. The fog below him was moving, not drifting, but surging, spiraling around the base of the tower. Beneath it, countless faint lights glowed, swirling upward like souls rising from the deep. Faces emerged in the mist. Men, women, children. Eyes, empty. Mouths open in silent cries. They rose toward him. He backed away, heart pounding. Then, in the distance, through the fog, he saw a single flicker of orange, far out at sea. A ship's lantern. The voices whispered as one, "Guide them." Thomas's body trembled. He turned back toward the darkened lens. "If I relight it," he said aloud, "will you let me go?" No answer, only the faintest sound, waves against stone, like laughter. He closed his eyes. "All right," he whispered. "I'll light it." He reached for the manual crank, cold and stiff from rust. He turned it slowly, forcing the lens to move again. The ghostly glass began to rotate. He struck a match and touched it to the old wick, expecting nothing. The flame leapt to life instantly, brilliant and white. Outside, the fog screamed. Thomas fell to his knees, covering his ears. The light flared brighter, and in that searing brilliance he saw them, the dead of the sea, writhing in the beam, retreating toward the depths. And then, just as quickly, they were gone. The fog thinned, the sea returned, the light continued to turn, steady and calm. Thomas collapsed against the wall, trembling. He had done it. He had obeyed. But as he sat there in the glow, he realized something was wrong. He couldn't move his legs. The stone beneath him had begun to fuse with his skin, slick, white, and cold. He tried to cry out, but his voice caught in his throat. His hands stiffened, his breath slowed. The lens turned, casting its eternal beam. In its reflection, he saw his own face, grey, hollow-eyed, staring back. And behind him, the ghost of Elias Ward smiled. When Thomas opened his eyes, the world had turned grey. The first thing he noticed was the silence, thick, oppressive, unnatural. The wind had died. The sea, once ever present, no longer roared or hissed against the cliffs. He was lying at the base of the lantern room, his cheek pressed to the cold stone. The great lens still revolved above him, its light burning steady and pale. He sat up slowly, wincing. His limbs were stiff, his fingers numb. When he looked down, he half expected to see himself bound in chains or brine, but the floor was clean, dry, untouched. The memory of what had happened returned like a flood. The voices, the fog, the faces rising from the deep, the ghost of Elias Ward. He touched his recorder. The red light was still blinking. Recording. He pressed stop and played it back, but only static filled the speaker. Not a word of what he'd said remained. The static grew louder the longer it played, a crackling hiss that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. He shut it off, uneasy. He stood, his legs weak, and looked out through the glass panes. The fog had lifted. Dawn painted the sea in pale blue light. Start points stretched before him in lonely splendor, the cliffs sharp as blades, the waves calm as glass. He should have felt relief. Instead, dread settled deep in his stomach. For there, on the rocks below, stood a man, tall, still, dressed in the long coat of a 19th century keeper. Elias Ward. Thomas blinked hard. The figure didn't vanish. It looked up toward the lantern room. Even at that distance, Thomas felt those black eyes find him. The man raised one arm, not in greeting, but in command, and pointed toward the sea. And then he was gone. Thomas staggered back from the glass. "No," he whispered. "You're not real. You're long dead." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. The air itself carried a residue of presence, like a lingering hand on his shoulder. The light had done something. It had opened a door, and now, whatever waited on the other side, had not yet closed it. He forced himself down the stairwell, needing movement, air, anything to keep from drowning in his own thoughts. His flashlight beam jittered over the walls, revealing fresh moisture slicking the stone. The air grew colder, the lower he went. When he reached the base of the tower, he stopped short. The trapdoor stood open. It hadn't just opened, it had been forced apart. The hinges were bent backward, the wood splintered, as if something had clawed its way out. The black water stains from the night before had spread across the floorboards in a circular pattern, like a tide mark. Thomas approached cautiously. The stench rising from below was foul and sweet, rotting kelp, and something older, metallic. He shone his light into the opening. A staircase descended into the rock, stone steps slick with algae. He hadn't known there was a cellar below the lighthouse. It wasn't on any of the blueprints. At the bottom, something glimmered faintly, reflecting his beam. He swallowed hard. Ward? No reply. Only a faint echo of dripping water. He hesitated. Every instinct screamed to leave, to run, to forget the story and live. But curiosity, his oldest, most fatal flaw, pressed him onward. The air grew thicker as he descended. The steps were narrow, uneven. His hand trailed along the damp wall, feeling the grooves of ancient tool marks. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a chamber carved directly into the stone foundation. The walls shimmered faintly with salt crystals. In the center stood a massive iron basin, shaped like an old ship's cauldron. Above it hung rusted chains and the remains of a pulley. The basin was filled not with oil, but water, black, perfectly still. Thomas knelt beside it and peered in. The surface reflected the glow of his flashlight, but it didn't behave like ordinary water. It seemed deeper than it should have been, infinitely deep, like a mirror into the sea itself. And then it rippled. He leaned closer. Beneath the surface, shapes began to move, pale faces turning upward, dozens, hundreds, drifting like the drowned. Their eyes opened in unison, staring directly at him. He stumbled back, his heart pounding. The water settled again, smooth and still, as if nothing had disturbed it. He caught his breath and noticed something on the wall opposite him. A marking carved deep into the stone. Custos Lux, Latin, keeper of the light. He reached out to trace the letters. The stone pulsed faintly beneath his fingertips. When he withdrew his hand, a faint voice whispered from the basin. He did not answer. Thomas froze. Who didn't? The one before you. He let the light die. He turned his flashlight on the basin again. The water had begun to churn slowly, forming a spiral. We waited, the voice said. Now we wait no longer. The spiral deepened, revealing what lay beneath. Bones, tangled nets, the remnants of ships long wrecked, and among them, faces he recognized from old ship manifests, from photographs in his research. Crewmen from ships lost off start point over the centuries. He stepped back toward the stairs. I can't help you, he said, his voice shaking. I'm not the keeper. The voice rose, overlapping into many. Then you are the light. A sound like thunder shook the chamber. The basin erupted, sending a column of black water slamming against the ceiling. Thomas stumbled, shielding his face as icy spray drenched him. When he looked again, the water had vanished. The basin was empty. But now, the walls dripped seawater, and from above, faintly, came the sound of the lens turning again. He ran. Back up the stairs, 2, 3 steps at a time, heart hammering. As he reached the entryway, he realized the air had changed. The smell of burning oil filled his nostrils. The light had reawakened. He climbed toward it, though fear screamed in every nerve. The narrow stairwell seemed to twist longer than before, stretching impossibly high. By the time he reached the lantern room, the beam blazed bright once more. It turned faster now, almost frantically. The ghost of Elias Ward stood beside the mechanism, one hand resting on the lens. His skin glowed faintly with the same eerie light. You opened the way, Ward said. You heard them. Thomas could barely speak. What is this place? Ward looked toward the sea. It was never meant to guide the living. This light was built over the grave of the drowned. The architects did not know. The foundation lies on their bones. When the sea took them, it took their souls as well. The light binds them, but only if it burns. Thomas felt the horror sink in. And when it goes out, Ward turned to him slowly. Then the dead come ashore. Thomas's stomach twisted. You mean they're trying to escape? They are trying to return. The sea does not give back without taking. Ward's expression softened, almost sorrowful. Every keeper is chosen. Every keeper must pay. He stepped closer. His translucent hand hovered just above Thomas's chest. When my light failed, they came for me. They dragged me below, but part of me remained bound to the tower. You will learn what it means to keep the light. Thomas backed away. No, I won't. I'm leaving. Tonight. Ward's gaze darkened. There is no leaving. The path down has gone. Look. Thomas turned toward the window and felt his blood freeze. The cliffs were gone. The lighthouse stood alone now, surrounded by water. The land had vanished beneath a rolling grey sea. He looked back at Ward. What have you done? It is not I, the ghost said softly. It is the sea. It comes for its due. The tower groaned as waves smashed against its base. Spray burst through the cracks in the glass. The beam flickered, its rhythm faltering. Ward reached toward the mechanism, trying to steady it. But his ghostly hands passed through. He turned to Thomas, eyes desperate. You must keep it burning. I don't know how. The flame is below. The basin must be filled. Use the light of your life if you must, but do not let it die. The room shuddered violently. A deep, resonant crack split the air. The ghost screamed. They are coming. Thomas bolted down the stairs, the air filling with the thunder of waves. Water poured in from unseen cracks, streaming down the walls. He could hear voices again, countless voices rising from the sea below. When he reached the trap door, the chamber beyond glowed faintly, as though lit from within. He descended once more, water splashing around his ankles. The basin had refilled, churning with dark energy. As he approached, a shape broke the surface, a face twisted with rage and hunger, then another and another. The dead were rising. He remembered Ward's words, use the light of your life. His lantern had long gone out, his matches soaked. Desperate, he yanked the chain hanging over the basin. Sparks burst as old iron scraped against stone, and the water caught fire, an unholy blue flame that burned without heat. The faces screamed and sank, drawn back into the depths. The light roared up through the stairwell, through the tower, igniting the lens above. The beacon blazed so bright, it turned the sea to glass. Thomas screamed as the blue fire crawled up his arms, searing not flesh, but soul. And then, silence. When he opened his eyes again, he was standing in the lantern room. The sea was calm, the fog was gone, but Elias Ward was nowhere to be seen. Thomas turned toward the lens and saw his own reflection, only it wasn't moving as he did. It stood still, eyes hollow, watching him, and as the beam turned, it smiled. The first few hours of dawn passed in a haze. Thomas stood in the lantern room, staring out across a sea that refused to look real. It glimmered with a sheen of silver, as though frozen mid-motion. Even the waves that struck the cliffs below moved sluggishly, like syrup instead of salt water. The great lens revolved slowly, steady and soundless. It no longer needed oil. It no longer needed power. It burned with a bluish flame that pulsed faintly with each heartbeat he took. When he lifted his hand, the light inside the lens seemed to flicker in rhythm with him. He backed away, the realization dawning like ice in his veins. Ward's last words echoed in his mind. Use the light of your life. He touched his chest. His pulse was faint, slower than it should have been. The warmth of his skin had dulled. The light was drawing from him. He descended the spiral stairs, step by cautious step, every sound amplified by the unnatural stillness. The air carried a faint hum now, as though the tower itself had begun to breathe. At the base, He found the trapdoor sealed again, tight as if it had never been broken. When he pressed his ear to it, he heard the distant rumble of the tide far below. But interwoven with it were voices, whispers, hundreds of them. He caught fragments, names, prayers, pleas, the drowned. Thomas staggered back. The sea had quieted above, but it was speaking beneath. He fumbled for his recorder again, desperate to capture proof. When he pressed play, his own voice filled the tower. "It is not I. It is the sea. It comes for its due." He froze. That wasn't him. It was Ward's voice. He rewound, played it again. "Use the light of your life." Again. "Do not let it die." Static followed. Then, faintly, the sound of something scratching metal, as if nails were dragging across the recorder's shell from the inside. He dropped it. The device clattered across the floor and fell silent. He couldn't stay. Every instinct screamed to leave the island before night returned. But when he looked through the lighthouse door, there was no path to go by. The sea had risen higher than ever, flooding the steps. And yet, there was something about the water that wasn't right. It looked flat, featureless. He took one cautious step outside. The air bit cold and metallic. Gulls circled above, but their cries came slow, distorted, like echoes underwater. A shape bobbed near the rocks below. He narrowed his eyes. A boat. It looked impossibly old. Oak planks warped by time, its single lantern flickering with the same blue hue as the beacon. Inside sat a figure in oilskins, face hidden beneath a hood. Thomas shouted, "Hey!" Up here. The figure looked up slowly, revealing a pale face, eyes black and wide. The voice that answered was soft, but carried clearly through the still air. "Keeper." Thomas froze. "I'm not the keeper." "You are now." The figure motioned toward the base of the tower. "Come, the tide is waiting." And then, before Thomas could speak, the boat drifted backward, vanishing into the mist that suddenly rolled in from nowhere. When the fog cleared, the sea was empty again. That night, the lighthouse grew restless. The flame within the lens began to flare brighter, flooding the room with blue-white light that bled through the windows like veins of lightning. The tower groaned under invisible strain, its stones expanding and contracting as though alive. Thomas tried to sleep on the floor of the keeper's quarters, but each time he closed his eyes, the voices returned, soft, insistent, weaving in and out of his dreams. He saw the old keepers, one after another, each bound to the light. Some went mad, some drowned themselves, some simply vanished, and always, behind them, the figure of Elias Ward, holding the flame. He awoke to find water dripping from the ceiling. The boards beneath him were wet. The sea had risen again. He grabbed his camera and rushed outside, half expecting the island to be gone entirely. It wasn't, but it was smaller. The water had swallowed the lower cliffs, leaving only a narrow ring of stone around the tower. And scattered across the waves were lanterns, dozens of them, bobbing gently, each burning with that same impossible blue light. The nearest drifted close enough for him to see the face reflected in its glass. A woman's, pale and gaunt, her mouth open as if mid-scream. He stumbled backward, nearly falling. The lantern sank, its light fading into the depths. Another surfaced. A man this time, then another. They weren't lanterns, they were souls. The drowned were gathering. He turned back toward the tower and stopped. A man stood in the doorway. At first, Thomas thought it was Ward again, but this one was different. Taller, younger, his skin a sickly grey. His clothing was tattered, seaweed clinging to every seam. His eyes glowed faintly. "You took my place," the man said. Thomas shook his head. "No, I didn't." You lit the fire. It burns because of you. Now you must tend it. I don't understand what it wants." The man's mouth twisted into something like a smile. "It wants what it always has. Memory. Flesh. The sea forgets nothing." He stepped forward, water dripping from his boots, though none trailed behind. "When the light burns out, they'll come for you as they came for me. Who are you?" "The last keeper." He turned, gesturing toward the black horizon, where lightning now danced beneath the clouds. "They're already rising." And then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, he was gone. Only a puddle of seawater remained where he had stood. The tower shuddered again, this time with greater violence. From high above, the light began to strobe erratically, on, off, on again, casting the cliffs in flashes of ghostly brilliance. Each time it dimmed, Thomas saw shapes moving in the darkness below. Figures climbing the rocks, hands, arms, faces, slick with brine and rot. The drowned were coming ashore. He ran inside, slamming the door. The hinges rattled, the wood bowing under pressure from unseen hands. The sound of nails scraping echoed from the other side. He bolted the latch and sprinted up the stairs, desperate to reach the lantern room. His breath came in ragged bursts. The light faltered again, its glow weakening. Ward's words thundered in his skull. "Do not let it die!" He burst into the lantern room. The flame within the lens had shrunk to a trembling spark. The machinery around it whined and clicked as though choking. Thomas grabbed the oil can, empty. He searched the shelves, found another, dry. The flame guttered again, nearly gone. "No, no, no, come on." He reached instinctively toward the lens. As his fingers brushed the glass, the blue light flared again, searing through him. He screamed, falling to his knees. His vision went white. When it cleared, he wasn't in the lantern room anymore. He was standing at the edge of the sea. A cold wind howled. The sky above was an endless grey void. The ocean stretched infinite, mirror smooth. He saw Ward ahead, standing knee-deep in the water, holding the same lantern he'd seen before. Its blue flame burned steady. Thomas stumbled toward him. "Where am I?" Ward turned, his face sorrowful. "You're between, the place where the light draws its power, the sea of the forgotten." All around them, faint figures drifted just below the surface. Faces, limbs, fragments of ships. Every ship lost on these rocks, every soul that cried out for the light and found only darkness. They remain here. The flame feeds on remembrance. It burns because they do not fade. Thomas looked back toward the horizon. "Why me?" "Because you came on All Hallows' Eve. When the veil is thinnest, the tower needs a keeper." Ward stepped closer, the lantern casting cold fire across his face. "If the light dies, the veil breaks. The drowned will walk the shore, and the sea will swallow the living world." Thomas's heart raced. "Then tell me how to stop it." Ward's eyes glowed faintly. "You already know. You felt it. The light takes from life to feed itself. That is the law of the deep." Thomas understood then. His pulse slowing, his warmth fading. It had all been the cost. If he left now, the light would go out. If he stayed, it would keep burning. Forever. Ward extended his hand. "Join me, and the sea will rest a little longer." Thomas hesitated. "And if I refuse?" Ward's expression darkened. "Then you doom them all." The water rose around his knees, icy and alive. Beneath the surface, faces turned upward, mouths opening as if to breathe. He looked back toward the shore and saw the lighthouse, its beam flickering wildly. The sky above it was splitting open, revealing a churning void of black waves and lightning. He had no choice. Thomas took the lantern from Ward's hand. The moment his fingers closed around the handle, fire surged through his body. He screamed as light poured from his eyes, his mouth, his chest. The sea roared and then went still. When the world returned, he was back in the lantern room. The lens turned smoothly, its beam strong once more. He felt no heartbeat, no breath. His reflection in the glass stared back. But the eyes were Ward's. Down below, the voices of the drowned quieted. The sea for now had been appeased. Dawn never came. The world beyond the lantern room remained locked in a perpetual twilight, as if time itself had drowned with the tide. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, colourless and cold. Thomas stood beside the great lens, motionless. The blue fire within it burned steady now, stronger than it had since his arrival. Its light painted everything in pale shades of silver, washing out warmth, shadow, and memory alike. He could not remember how long he'd stood there. Minutes, hours, days. It no longer mattered. The beating of his heart was gone, replaced by the slow turning of the mechanism beside him. He was the light now, and yet, in the quiet recesses of what was left of his mind, he still felt a flicker of humanity refusing to die. That was when he began to hear the whispers again. At first, they were faint, like wind through the stones. Then clearer, familiar. Thomas. He turned. The voice came from behind him, echoing through the stairwell. He recognized it. Sarah Green. She was the producer who'd sent him on this expedition. The voice of reason behind his obsession. He hadn't thought of her since the night he'd arrived. Thomas, are you there? The signal's terrible. Say something. He blinked. Could she really be here? He rushed down the stairs, his movements slow, as though pushing through heavy water. Each footfall echoed in a hollow rhythm. At the base of the tower, the radio crackled faintly, glowing green. He snatched it up. Sarah! It's me! Static swallowed his words. Then her voice again, distant but clear. We've been trying to reach you for days. The Coast Guard says there's no one on the island. Where are you? Thomas froze. Days? He looked out through the small window. The sea beyond was flat, motionless, unbroken by any wave or wind. Thomas, please, if you can hear this, we found your equipment, the recorder, the camera, but there's nothing on them except noise. The static deepened. Thomas? He lifted the radio closer to his ear. Sarah, listen to me. Don't send anyone else. Keep the light burning. Thomas, you sound strange. We're coming. No, he shouted. You can't come here. The radio screamed. A burst of high, piercing feedback tore through the air, forcing him to drop it. When the sound cut off, the room fell silent once more. He stood shaking, the echo of his own voice ringing in the hollow space. And then, from the shadows behind him, came another voice. It's too late. Elias Ward emerged from the stairwell, faint and flickering like a candle in a draught. The living always come. They hear the call, same as you did. Thomas's voice trembled. You told me it was over. Ward smiled, a tired, joyless smile. The sea never rests. It remembers. It hungers. You gave it your life, and so it gave you mine. Thomas turned toward the window again. The horizon had changed. A dark shape moved slowly across the still waters. A ship. It was impossible, yet unmistakable. A modern research vessel, its deck lights piercing the mist. They've come for you, Ward said. They will find what's left of your body. They will hear your voice in the static. They will see the light and think it's safe. Thomas's breath caught, though he no longer needed to breathe. They'll die. Ward's eyes burned faintly. Every light draws moths. The ghost's form began to fade, becoming one with the shadows. Keep the flame, Thomas. That's all there is. And then he was gone. The hours that followed were a blur of dread. The research vessel crept closer, its engines humming softly across the still water. Through the glass, Thomas could see figures on deck, people moving about, cameras, radios, a searchlight sweeping the cliffs. He wanted to warn them, to tell them to turn back, but the words would not come. Each time he tried to shout, his voice turned into static, hissing and crackling in the air. Below, the sea began to churn. The flat surface broke apart, swirling as though something vast moved beneath it. The blue glow of the lantern intensified, flashing in rhythm with the water's pulse. The drowned were stirring again. The first scream came from the deck below. Thomas pressed his hands against the window, powerless. One of the crew had fallen overboard, or been pulled. Another reached for him, only to vanish too. The ship's lights flickered. One by one, the figures disappeared, swallowed by the dark. And then, the sea went still again. Only the research vessel remained, empty, its hull gently knocking against the rocks below the lighthouse. The blue light above burned brighter as though feeding. Thomas sank to his knees. No, I didn't want this. The lens turned, casting its beam far out across the ocean. Within its reflection, he could see faces now. Hundreds of them, shimmering faintly within the glow. Some he recognized. Some were strangers. They were watching him. The drowned had found their keeper. Time dissolved after that. Storms rose and fell, though he never felt the rain. Ships passed and vanished, leaving no wake. The sea around Start Point became a graveyard, silent and deep. And yet the light burned on, eternal, unwavering. Thomas grew to understand its rhythm, the way it pulsed with each soul it took, the faint hum of satisfaction when the sea was calm. He learned to listen to the whispers of the dead, to guide them toward the flame when they drifted too near the veil. Sometimes they screamed, sometimes they wept, sometimes, for a fleeting instant, they sang. He was no longer afraid. Fear was for the living. Centuries might have passed, or only hours. One evening, if evening still had meaning, a change came over the sea. The water turned black, reflecting no light. The air grew heavy, as though something vast and ancient had risen from beneath the waves. From the horizon came a new sound, the tolling of a distant bell. Deep, hollow, endless. Thomas looked toward it, and for the first time since his transformation, he felt something close to dread. The flame within the lens flickered. The sea spoke, not in whispers this time, but in a single voice, vast enough to shake the tower. Keeper. He fell to his knees, clutching the railing. The sound reverberated through his skull. The tide changes. All things must return. He understood then. Even eternity has its end. The sea wanted him back. The tower shuddered violently. Cracks spidered through the walls. The great lens groaned, spinning faster, faster, until the light became a solid column of brilliance. Below, the water rose higher than ever before, slamming against the foundation. The roar was deafening. The flame began to dim. Thomas reached for it instinctively, pressing his hands to the glass. His reflection stared back, no longer quite human, his eyes burning with the same blue fire. "I am the light," he whispered. "I am the keeper." But the sea did not listen. The water surged up through the stairwell, crashing into the lantern room, shattering the glass. The flame flickered wildly. The tower groaned one final time. And then, with a sound like the world's breath being drawn in, it fell silent. When the storm cleared, the sea was calm. The lighthouse stood intact once more, its beams steady and bright. But there was no sign of Thomas Gray or of Elias Ward. Only the light remained, sweeping across the empty waters, its blue fire burning eternally. 2 months later, a fishing trawler off the Devon coast reported seeing a strange illumination near Start Point, an unnatural blue light that burned through heavy fog. When the Coast Guard arrived, they found no one. The island's foundation was flooded, the stairs slick with algae, but the beacon still turned, without oil, without power. A single logbook lay open on the keeper's desk. The last entry, written in a trembling hand, read, October 31st. The sea remembers. The light must burn. I am its keeper now. TG. No further expeditions were sent. But sometimes, on Halloween night, locals still claim to see the beam from Start Point sweeping across the horizon, casting a pale, spectral glow upon the waves. And if you listen closely to the static on a radio, you might hear a voice whisper, "Keep the light burning."